Hi, I'm Adrianne C. Smith, Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Fleishman-Hillard, and we just had an amazing conversation with a collective of Chief Diversity Officers from all over the world in conversation with Ruth Umoh from Fortune magazine. Ruth, I mean, I can only say how powerful the conversation was for me. How did it go for you?
I mean, what a riveting conversation. First of all, thank you so much to Fleishman-Hillard for hosting me and allowing me to tap your wealth of knowledge. We touched on a plethora of issues, and I think one thing that really stood out to me is whether this discussion about whether DEI's fall from grace has really been overblown. You know, I'm a journalist, and I think one thing that the media has harped on time and time again is that DEI teams are getting smaller, and companies are getting rid of chief diversity officers, and companies aren't as committed to diversity and inclusion as we've seen in years past. And kind of the summary here is that companies are still just as committed. Certainly CEOs are getting quieter about it. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but they are still doing the work. It's more so of a head down focus rather than externally vocalizing every single effort that they are promoting and pushing. So I thought that was quite eye-opening.
No, I think that's great. And I always say, you know, as it relates to these conversations, it's like, don't believe the hype.
Yes.
DEI will never die. And I think that message was clear. It was more about what DEI needs to maybe be restructured, how we communicate about it, how we emphasize the type of work and the type of DEI subject matter expert does the work within an organization has to be thought about. And I think that is so important as we think about the growth and expansion of embedding this work within our organizations and to create sustainable opportunities and cultures within.
I think you hit the nail on the head, and just to piggyback off of that, one thing that was brought up, was touched on time and time again in that conversation, was also thinking about DEI through the lens of business strategy. How do we ensure that we're repeatedly showing that it's driving financial performance, that we're really leveraging it as a business and developmental tool rather than just this altruistic measure? What exactly is this doing for a particular business line for our employees, and how can we demonstrate that in a really concrete and tangible way?
Another big point during this conversation was how we need more CEOs engaged in the conversation. And there was mention that one CEO talked about, you know, not previously being engaged, but thinking about the barriers that it creates to keep his company from growing. And that became like a critical touch point. So what are CEOs doing, and how are they leaning into the conversation?
Yeah, and I love that we're seeing more of this pivot to systemic issues, as you just alluded to, and some of those structural biases, and moving away from more surface level metrics like representation. Not to say that it's not important, but we're digging a little bit deeper and really elevating the conversation. However, we need to see many more CEOs really speaking out in a public manner, because as we know, change starts from the top and it really trickles down to the rest of the organization. So CEOs, please speak up. Your employees and your customers are watching.
Yes, and CEOs and CDIOs work together. That was sort of the next evolution of this conversation. I heard loud and clear, please, let's invite the CEOs and the CDIOs in the room. Let's expand the conversation of C-suite executives, because that is where the information and the press has to come from. And when I say press, I mean push. That is where it comes from. We're leading from the top, and everyone else will follow suit based off of the company culture and commitment.
But the press also will push, I must say. We talked about the upcoming 2024 election cycle. Talk to me about that and what diversity had said.
You know, I think what was so important is the scenario planning and thinking about, you know, all red, all blue, half red, half blue. It seems like a color-coded, you know, mission glass, if that's, you know, right word to use. But we have to think about it. How are we thinking about our employees and bringing in that diversity of political thought? That's something that's been taboo for most organizations, but the reality is, if we think about people who work from home now, they come with backgrounds and you know, issues that they want to talk about, and sometimes they don't feel comfortable. Is the workplace the right place to have these conversations? But I think it would be a misstep not to be able to have conversations about people's everyday lived lives. And so I know that is a point for us to say, what's next? How do we bring in these conversations more, better, more inclusive on the conversation of DEI? So I thank you, Ruth, for having that brief moment with us, and I look forward to doing it again.
Likewise. Thanks so much for having me.